It's April 1688, and the ship Berg China rocks gently in Table Bay, as 180 French Huguenot refugees disembark onto South African soil. Among them is Pierre Joubert, a skilled winemaker fleeing religious persecution in France. In his weathered hands, he carries a small bag of vine cuttings, the last remnants of his family's vineyard, destroyed by Louis XIV's dragoons. But Pierre isn't alone on this unfamiliar shore. Waiting to greet him is Hans Grimm, a German settler who arrived 30 years earlier, speaking broken Dutch and carrying the tools of a master carpenter. Nearby stands Jan van Riebeck's son, now a prosperous free burgher, watching these newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Within a single generation, this small patch of African coastline has become home to Dutch company men, German craftsmen, French refugees, and freed company employees, each group bringing distinct languages, customs, and dreams. They're not just European settlers, they're a complex tapestry of peoples, each with their own story of why they left Europe and what they hope to build in Africa. What's remarkable is how different these groups were from each other, and how those differences would shape a nation. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. When we think of early European settlement in South Africa, we often imagine a single, monolithic group of colonizers. But the reality was far more complex and fascinating. Between 1652 and 1800, at least 8 distinct European groups established themselves at the Cape, each bringing unique cultures, skills, and motivations that would fundamentally shape the emerging South African identity. Who were these diverse groups, and what made each one unique? How did a Dutch company official differ from a German craftsman or a French Huguenot refugee? What drove Scandinavian sailors to stay or Swiss farmers to trek inland? And how did these groups interact with each other? Sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, often clashing over resources, religion, and social status. The truth is, early South Africa wasn't built by a single European culture, but by a fascinating collision of different European traditions, languages, and worldviews. A German Lutheran and a French Calvinist might both be Protestant, but they brought very different approaches to farming, family life, and community organization. A Dutch company employee and a Dutch free burgher might speak the same language, but they had entirely different relationships with authority and independence. These differences weren't just cultural curiosities, they shaped everything, from agricultural practices to political structures, from religious institutions to social hierarchies. Understanding these 8 groups helps us understand how modern South Africa's complex identity was forged. This is the story of how Europe's diversity became Africa's complexity, and how 8 different dreams of colonial life created one of the world's most fascinating settler societies. To understand the complexity of European settlement in South Africa, we must first grasp the extraordinary circumstances that brought these diverse groups to the southern tip of Africa. The year 1652 marked not just the beginning of permanent European settlement, but the start of one of history's most intricate colonial experiments. The Dutch East India Company's decision to establish a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope was purely strategic. Ships traveling to the lucrative spice markets of the East Indies needed a halfway point to repair vessels, treat scurvy, and resupply with fresh water and provisions. What began as a simple trading post would evolve into something far more complex and far-reaching. But the Cape Colony's unique geography and position created unusual conditions for European settlement. Unlike other colonial ventures focused on extracting specific resources like gold or sugar, the Cape offered something different: fertile land, a Mediterranean climate, and strategic maritime importance. This combination would attract not just Dutch company employees, but refugees, adventurers, craftsmen, and farmers from across Europe. The religious wars that had torn Europe apart for over a century played a crucial role in shaping who came to South Africa. The devastation of the 30 Years' War had left German states economically ruined and politically fragmented. Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 drove skilled French Protestants from their homeland. Religious persecution, economic hardship, and political instability across Europe created a steady stream of emigrants seeking new opportunities. The Dutch East India Company's labor policies also influenced the demographic composition of the colony. Initially, the company intended to rely entirely on its own employees and imported slave labor. However, the remote location and harsh conditions made it difficult to maintain a stable workforce. By 1657, the company began releasing employees from their contracts, allowing them to become free burghers, independent farmers and artisans who could establish their own businesses while remaining under company authority. This policy decision had profound consequences. Unlike purely extractive colonies where Europeans remained temporarily to exploit resources, the Cape began developing a permanent settler population with long-term interests in the land. These free burghers weren't just company employees serving a term, they were building lives, establishing families, and creating communities they intended to pass on to their children. The company's recruitment practices also shaped the colony's diversity. Skilled craftsmen were desperately needed: carpenters, blacksmiths, masons, vintners, and farmers with specialized knowledge. The company actively recruited from German states, where skilled artisans were abundant but opportunities were limited. French Huguenots brought viticulture expertise that would transform the Cape's wine industry. Scandinavian sailors, skilled in maritime trades, often chose to remain when their ships departed. The geographical isolation of the Cape created unique social dynamics. Unlike European colonies in the Americas, where settlers could maintain closer cultural ties with their homelands, Cape colonists were truly cut off from Europe. Ships arrived perhaps twice a year, and communication with family and friends in Europe was sporadic at best. This isolation forced different European groups to interact and cooperate in ways that might not have occurred in more accessible colonial settings. The indigenous Khoikhoi and San peoples already inhabiting the region added another layer of complexity. European settlers didn't encounter an empty landscape but established societies with their own sophisticated systems of land use, trade, and social organization. The interactions between different European groups and indigenous peoples would shape the colony's development in ways that none of the original planners had anticipated. By 1700, the Cape had become a unique society, neither purely Dutch nor purely African, but something entirely new. The stage was set for the arrival of even more diverse European groups, each of which would add their own distinct elements to this emerging colonial identity. The story begins with Jan van Riebeeck and his 90 companions, who stepped ashore at the Cape in April 1652. These men weren't colonists in the traditional sense. They were employees of the Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational corporation. Their mission was clear: establish a reliable supply station for company ships and do it as cheaply as possible. These early Dutch officials brought with them the rigid hierarchy and bureaucratic structure of the VOC. Commander Van Riebeeck answered directly to the company's board in Amsterdam, and every decision had to be justified in terms of profit and efficiency. The company men lived in a world of detailed regulations, strict schedules, and constant accountability to distant shareholders. But the Cape environment began changing these company men in unexpected ways. Hendrik Boom, a company bookkeeper, found himself learning to identify indigenous plants with medicinal properties. Roelof Diodati, a ship surgeon, discovered he had a talent for negotiating with Khoikhoi leaders. These men were becoming something new, not quite Dutch, not quite African, but hybrid figures, adapting to circumstances their corporate training had never anticipated. The company's official policy was to maintain strict separation between Europeans and indigenous peoples, but practical necessities often overrode official directives. Company men learned local languages, adopted local foods, and developed trading relationships that went far beyond what Amsterdam had envisioned. They were becoming the first Afrikaners, though they wouldn't use that term for another century. By 1657, it became clear that the company's employee-only policy wasn't sustainable. The Cape needed permanent settlers who would have personal stakes in the colony's success. The company released 9 employees from their contracts, granting them land and the right to farm independently. These were the first free burghers, literally free citizens, and they represented a fundamental shift in the colony's character. Men like Stephen Botma and Harmon Remagen weren't just changing careers, they were changing their entire relationship with authority and land. As company employees, they had been temporary residents following orders. As free burghers, they became permanent settlers with the right to make their own decisions about farming, family, and community organization. The free burghers developed a distinct culture that blended Dutch traditions with African adaptations. They spoke Dutch, but increasingly incorporated Khoikhoi and Malay words. They maintained Reformed Protestant faith, but adapted their farming practices to African conditions. They considered themselves Dutch, but their daily lives bore little resemblance to those of their cousins in Holland. These free burghers also developed a particular relationship with land that would have profound consequences for South African history. Unlike company employees, who saw the Cape as a temporary assignment, free burghers saw it as their permanent home. They developed an emotional attachment to the African landscape and a sense of ownership that would drive expansion inland for generations. From the earliest days of the colony, German settlers formed the largest non-Dutch European group at the Cape. Men like Hans Grimm arrived as company employees, but many stayed on as free burghers, bringing crucial skills the colony desperately needed. The German state's economic devastation following the 30 Years' War had created a diaspora of skilled craftsmen seeking opportunities elsewhere. What made the German settlers unique was their technical expertise. Johann Gottfried Beutler arrived with advanced knowledge of metallurgy that revolutionized the colony's ironworking capabilities. Peter Kappel brought brewing techniques that established the Cape's beer industry. These weren't just farmers, they were skilled artisans whose knowledge transformed the colony's economic base. The Germans also brought different approaches to community organization. While Dutch settlers often emphasized individual land ownership, German settlers were more likely to form cooperative enterprises. They established the first guilds at the Cape, creating formal structures for training apprentices and maintaining quality standards in crafts and trades. Linguistically, the German settlers had a profound impact on the development of Afrikaans. German grammatical structures and vocabulary became embedded in the evolving colonial language. Words like Geld, money, Kerk, church, and work, entered everyday usage, while German sentence structures influenced how the language developed. The arrival of French Huguenot refugees in 1688 marked a turning point in the colony's cultural development. These weren't economic migrants seeking better opportunities, they were skilled professionals fleeing religious persecution. Following Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes, men like Pierre Joubert, Jacques de Villiers, and François Dutoit brought expertise in viticulture, silk production, and advanced agricultural techniques. The Huguenots faced a unique challenge. They were Protestant refugees welcomed by a Protestant colony, but they spoke French and maintained distinct cultural practices. The Dutch authorities were simultaneously grateful for their skills and suspicious of their foreign customs. A deliberate policy of dispersal was implemented. Rather than allowing Huguenots to settle together, they were scattered among existing Dutch and German communities. This dispersal policy had fascinating consequences. Within a generation, most Huguenot families had intermarried with Dutch and German settlers, creating a truly mixed European population. The Dutoit family married into the Van der Merwe clan. The Jouberts allied with the Bothas, and the de Villiers connected with the Cloetes. These marriages weren't just personal unions, they were cultural fusions that enriched the entire colony. The Huguenots' greatest contribution was arguably their transformation of Cape wine production. Their expertise in viticulture, combined with the Cape's Mediterranean climate, created South Africa's wine industry. The techniques they introduced, from pruning methods to fermentation processes, established traditions that continue today. But they also brought something less tangible, a culture of excellence and attention to detail that elevated the colony's aspirations. The British occupation of the Cape in 1795 introduced an entirely different dynamic to the colony's European population. Unlike previous groups who had come as immigrants or refugees, the British arrived as conquerors. They brought not just different customs and language, but different assumptions about governance, law, and social organization. The first British settlers were primarily military personnel and administrators, tasked with securing the colony for the crown. Men like Colonel Robert Jacob Gordon and Captain Francis Dundas weren't seeking to build new lives in Africa, they were extending British imperial authority. However, some British soldiers and officials did choose to remain when their terms of service ended, adding another layer to the colony's complexity. The British brought English common law traditions that sometimes conflicted with the Roman Dutch legal system already established at the Cape. They introduced different approaches to land tenure, commercial law, and administrative procedures. These changes created tensions, not just with indigenous peoples, but with existing European settlers who had developed their own legal traditions over 140 years of settlement. Perhaps most significantly, the British brought different attitudes towards slavery and indigenous peoples. While they didn't immediately abolish slavery, British officials began questioning practices that Dutch settlers had long taken for granted. These tensions would simmer for decades before erupting into major conflicts in the 19th century. Among the lesser-known European groups were Flemish and Belgian settlers, who arrived throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. These settlers occupied an interesting middle ground in the colony's ethnic landscape. They spoke Dutch or Flemish dialects, closely related to the language of the dominant Dutch population, but they brought distinct cultural traditions from the Low Countries. Flemish settlers like Jan Baptist van der Heyden were often skilled in textile production, a crucial industry that the Cape needed to develop. They brought knowledge of flax cultivation and linen production that helped diversify the colony's agricultural base. Belgian settlers contributed expertise in brewing and food preservation that improved the colony's ability to supply passing ships. What made the Flemish and Belgian settlers particularly interesting was their ease of integration with the existing Dutch population. Unlike French or German settlers, who maintained distinct linguistic identities, Flemish settlers could communicate easily with Dutch colonists, while still contributing their own cultural variations. They often served as cultural bridges, helping to mediate between different European groups. Scandinavian settlers, primarily Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, arrived at the Cape through various routes throughout the colonial period. Many were sailors who jumped ship or chose to remain when their vessels departed. Others were skilled craftsmen, recruited by the Dutch East India Company for specific projects. The Scandinavians brought crucial maritime skills that the colony needed. Men like Olaf Berg, a Norwegian ship's carpenter, established the colony's first proper shipyard. Swedish settlers contributed knowledge of timber selection and preservation, improving the colony's building techniques. Danish settlers often brought expertise in dairy farming, which enhanced the colony's food production. What distinguished Scandinavian settlers was their adaptability to the Cape's unique environment. Coming from northern European climates, they had to completely reimagine their agricultural and craft practices. Many became successful farmers, developing innovative techniques for cultivating European crops in African conditions. The final category encompasses the smaller but significant communities of Swiss, Portuguese, and Italian settlers, who contributed to the Cape's European diversity. Swiss settlers, like the Marais family, brought expertise in cheesemaking and alpine farming techniques. Portuguese settlers, some of whom were Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition, contributed knowledge of international trade and finance. Italian settlers were fewer in number, but often brought specialized skills in masonry, sculpture, and artistic crafts. They contributed to the colony's architectural development and helped establish some of its earliest cultural institutions. These smaller groups often integrated quickly with the larger European communities, but they maintained certain cultural practices that quietly added to the colony's overall diversity. The convergence of these 8 European groups at the Cape of Good Hope created something unprecedented in colonial history, a truly multicultural European society that was, somehow, both unified and diverse. By 1800, the Cape Colony had developed a distinct identity, one that drew from all these sources, while remaining uniquely African. The most visible impact? Language. The Dutch, spoken by the original VOC settlers, had evolved into something entirely new: German grammatical structures, French vocabulary, Flemish pronunciations, and indigenous words from Khoikhoi and Malay, all combined to create what would eventually become Afrikaans. This wasn't Dutch, simply corrupted by isolation. It was a new language, born from the colony's multicultural reality. Economically, these diverse European groups had shaped a colonial economy unlike any other in the 17th or 18th centuries. French Huguenots established a wine industry exporting to Europe and the East Indies. German craftsmen built manufacturing capabilities that reduced dependence on imports. British administrative systems created more efficient trade networks. Together, they made the Cape more resilient, more self-sufficient than most colonial outposts of the time. Socially, the lines blurred even further. Intermarriage between European groups created a population that was ethnically mixed but culturally coherent. By 1800, it was almost impossible to find a Cape family that didn't carry at least 2 or 3 European lineages. The van der Merwes had German and French ancestors, the Bothas, Dutch and Flemish, the Cloetes, Dutch, German, and Huguenot bloodlines. This genetic mixing had deep cultural consequences. Cape families celebrated Dutch holidays with German food, sang French hymns in Dutch translation, and told stories that pulled from traditions across the continent. What emerged was a hybrid culture, recognizably European, yet unmistakably local. Politically, the impact was just as complex. Dutch free burghers brought ideas of local autonomy. Germans, their guild-based cooperative structures. The French, a legacy of religious minority rights. And the British, common law traditions. These political strands didn't always align, but they created tensions and negotiations that would shape South African politics for generations. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of this colonial society was its adaptability. Unlike colonies shaped by a single European power, the Cape had learned to manage internal diversity, to adapt, absorb, evolve. It was a strength that would serve the colony well as it expanded inland and faced new challenges. But not all legacies were benign. European competition often intensified pressure on indigenous communities. German farmers seeking land, Huguenot vintners expanding their estates, British officials enforcing new policies, all played a role in dispossession and displacement. The diversity that enriched colonial society often came at the expense of indigenous peoples' rights, territories, and lives. Still, the cultural patterns established between 1652 and 1800, the blending of traditions, the formation of new languages, the rise of hybrid institutions would echo far beyond the colonial period. Understanding this early European diversity helps us understand the complexity and the contradictions of modern South African identity. The story of European settlement at the Cape of Good Hope challenges our simple narratives about colonialism and cultural contact. This wasn't a story of a single European power imposing its will on an African landscape, but rather a complex tale of multiple European cultures, adapting, competing, and ultimately blending to create something entirely new. The 8 European groups who shaped South Africa between 1652 and 1800, Dutch officials and free burghers, German craftsmen, French Huguenots, British administrators, Flemish artisans, Scandinavian sailors, and other European minorities, each brought distinct traditions, skills, and perspectives that enriched the emerging colonial society. Their interactions with one another and with indigenous peoples created a kind of cultural laboratory, where new forms of identity, new languages, and new social organization began to emerge. What makes this story particularly fascinating is how these different European groups managed to maintain their distinct contributions while creating a unified colonial identity. The Cape Colony of 1800 was recognizably European in its basic institutions and cultural orientation, but it was also unmistakably African in its adaptations and innovations. This was a society that could trace its roots to Amsterdam and Paris, Hamburg and Stockholm, yet it was utterly unique in its African context. This diversity would prove to be both a strength and a source of ongoing tension. The cultural richness that emerged from European mixing created a vibrant, adaptable society capable of thriving in challenging conditions. But that same diversity often intensified conflicts with indigenous peoples and created internal contradictions that would plague South African society for generations. Understanding these 8 European groups helps us appreciate both the complexity of early South African history and the deep roots of modern South African identity. The conversations happening around dinner tables in Stellenbosch today, the languages spoken in Cape Town streets, the cultural traditions celebrated in small Karoo towns, all bear the imprint of these early European settlers, who came to Africa with different dreams and created something none of them had originally imagined. This is the story of how Europe's diversity became Africa's complexity, and how the meeting of 8 different European traditions at the southern tip of Africa created one of the world's most fascinating cultural experiments.